Friday, February 4th at 6 p.m., we will be hosting a service of choral evensong. This service is about 35 minutes in length and is followed by a reception in the gallery to which all are invited. Choral evensong is a centuries-old tradition that continues to be prayed every day all over the world. Drawn from the 17th century, worshipers are invited to enter into a sacred space of reflection through music, scripture, and prayers that have shaped Christian lives for hundreds of years. Whether you are accustomed or not to choral evensong, we welcome you without reservation or expectation. Feel free to find a quiet corner in which to be alone in prayer, or if you prefer, sit near the front to be closer to the choir and to the clergy. The music is sung by the choir, offering praise to God on behalf of those gathered. The people join silently in prayer alongside them, in speaking together and in singing the hymn. In this particular service, we will be singing the music of 4 living women composers, 3 of whom originate from Canada. The service opens with the praises and responses set for upper voices by Cecilia McDowall. Sarah is a Canadian-born organist, conductor, and composer living in the UK and currently holds the positions of Fellow and Director of Music at Selwyn College, Cambridge, and Director of the Girl Choristers at Ely Cathedral. She has been at Selwyn since 1999 and is the first woman to be holding such a post in an Oxbridge chapel. The psalm chant is one that I was commissioned to write several years ago by Christ Episcopal Church, Cranbrook, Michigan. I wrote it at the kitchen table of the retreat house in upstate New York where I was staying at the time, and it's always an honor to have the cathedral choir sing my music. The canticles are those set by English composer Cecilia McDowell. Cecilia is no stranger to our congregation, as she has been part of our commissioning scheme here at the cathedral through Friends of Cathedral Music. Cecilia and I connected over Zoom to talk a little bit about her setting of the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis texts, and here's that conversation now. I have with me the witty, expressive, and highly communicative British composer extraordinaire, Cecilia McDowell. Welcome, Cecilia. Around this time of year back in 2018, here in Albuquerque, we were preparing for your visit with us at the Cathedral of St. John, where the Cathedral Choir was preparing to sing your setting of a work the Friends of Cathedral Music commissioned from you titled Ash Wednesday. And we had a marvelous time getting to know you a little, singing your music, hearing you speak about your music and compositional process, and even managed a bit of social fun, whisking you around local Irish pubs and such. And I'm pleased to say that we're looking forward to preparing that work to sing on Ash Wednesday here at the Cathedral coming up in early March. I suspect during lockdown, you've had several commissions since COVID began. And I wonder if you would mind sharing some of those highlights, especially some of the recent highlights.
Well, lovely to be with you. And I have such fond memories of 2018 and visiting Albuquerque. It was a wonderful time. So it's interesting. When the lockdown happened here, which was March 2020, I had a number of commissions that I had to finish, or at least thought I had to finish by a particular time. But of course, suddenly everything went right out of the window. And I really struggled to actually write. I found it so difficult. And I was really relieved when I found that there were other people who had similar difficulties, writers and artists, who said, as I felt, that it was really important to have outside contact with other people to feel stimulated into working. However, there always comes a day when can't put it off any longer, got to do it. And one of the pieces I was commissioned to write, which I was writing in May 2020, was a piece that was to be performed last year, 2021, to celebrate the life of Clara Barton, and one of your very remarkable ladies who founded the American Red Cross. And it was her bicentenary in 2021. And I had commissioned a poet to take some of her words from her diaries and to put them into some kind of context that I could set for the choir. The thing that was extraordinary, of course, was, as you'll all know, Clara Barton was, I think she was a self-taught nurse. I'm not sure that she ever called herself a nurse, but she certainly volunteered to nurse on the front line of in the American Civil War. And it just seemed extraordinary to the poet, Sean Street, and to me, that we were actually dealing with a piece that was all about healing. And during the course of it, George Floyd was murdered. And this raised an interesting situation, because I had decided to use the spiritual, There Is a Balm in Gilead, which is one I love, and all about healing again, and it seemed to work well in that context. But I was challenged by my publisher as to, is this not cultural appropriation, taking a spiritual and incorporating it into something that I'm writing when that's not my background? And it did encourage me to, well, I felt challenged now to look into the provenance of it and to see where this particular spiritual had arisen from. And it was quite interesting to see that it had begun life in England, in the Methodist Wesleyan tradition, and that in the middle of the 19th century, it was shared with the Afro-American community. So I felt that the timing of it was right, sort of halfway through the 19th century, and also the provenance, that it had some kind of relevance, in a way that I wasn't sort of taking something from somewhere where I felt it wasn't my territory. So that was one of the pieces. But then, of course, I finished it and I was told it couldn't be performed in 2021 for obvious reasons, and it couldn't be performed in 22 because people were not able to meet in this country. So the premiere is going to be in April 23. So I'm having to wait for that. But before then, I mean, there have been a number of other ones, but perhaps the one that perhaps many people know about, which was a real joy to write, was the commission that I received from King's College, Cambridge, for the Festival of Nine Lessons and Carols. And that was an absolute delight to write. And in some ways, it was made straightforward by the director of music, Dan Hyde, who had, of course, you all know him, had, of course, been the organist and choir master at St. Thomas's, New York. And when we originally had a conversation about this, he said, well, first of all, 3 minutes, that's it, which is always useful because some composers can just go on and on. So the timing was clear. Also, preferably not with organ, because the rehearsal period might be difficult. We didn't know at that time whether we'd be in lockdown, how difficult it would be to meet. And also because he said he wanted a moment of intimacy and quietness and stillness, that was useful for me to be able to look for words that I felt were appropriate for that particular situation. So it's always, I love the moment when I'm looking for words, and I also love it when people give me words as well, as you did with Ash Wednesday. I didn't know Ash Wednesday, so that was a good thing to know. But I found that the words that I really wanted to set, There Is No Rose, medieval words, they're macaronic. And just to explain, in case anybody doesn't know what macaronic means, it's a mixture of Latin and English. And I looked at all the commissions that had been written for King's College in the past, going all the way back to 83, and nobody had actually made a setting of There Is No Rose for that particular occasion. It's been done many, many times and extremely beautifully. And of course, everybody knows the Benjamin Britten, and perhaps you know the John Joubert as well, which is a lovely one. It's often done here. So that was a really splendid thing. And it was one of those feelings, even though Cambridge or Dan Hyde never indicated that it might not happen, there was always a feeling in the back of my mind that perhaps they would do what they did the previous year, which was to have nobody there. And as many people know, the Festival of Nine Lessons and Carols in 2020, let's get the year right, 2020, had no congregation. And even the men of the choir didn't sing because they had COVID. So they had to use the King's Singers. So it was a very different situation. But it was rather lovely this year because they included that carol in the BBC Two Carols from Kings as well. So it got 2 outings. And that is still available until next year, until next carol service on BBC Two. But that may be difficult to get in the States.
It might be. I just want to say, as someone who listened to the live broadcast, as I always do, from the comfort of my pajamas on Christmas Eve morning, it's always just such a lovely treat. And your setting of There Is No Rose is just unique and beautifully haunting and mesmerizing, and all of those words. And I remember texting you almost immediately after and saying, "Oh my gosh, that was so beautiful."
Yes.
Thank you for another setting of that I look forward to hopefully doing at some point with my choirs here.
Well, that would be wonderful. Thank you. What was strange was a journalist here had written something about the Festival of Nine Lessons and Carols for the New York Times. So there is an article in the New York Times, but what is amusing is it sort of centered around me. There's lots about other people as well, John Rutter, and many others as well. But what I had said originally was on Christmas Eve, I know it's late, on Christmas Eve at 3:00 when I listen to the King's Carols, I start making my Christmas pudding. And so there was a lot of discussion, but what's going to happen this year? You won't be there. So, So it begins and ends. It's all about Christmas pudding with an explanation as well as to what it is.
Right, because not everybody knows what Christmas pudding is or has ever had it. So did you end up having to make the pudding the day after?
Made it 3 weeks earlier.
Oh, fabulous. Good planning.
Yes. Yeah.
It had a good soak.
It did. Yeah. Yes. But I might just go back to being lazy and doing it on Christmas Eve in the future. It's easier. Oh.
So the Cathedral Choir are preparing to sing Choral Evensong next Friday here at the Cathedral. We do it just a few times a year. It'd be lovely to do it every day, but that's not quite where we're at here yet. And one of we're actually, first of all, performing works that are all written by living women composers. And so there's the Praises and Responses of Sarah Mcdonald, a psalm chant that I put together, and Your Canticles, and then an anthem by Sarah Cortell. So 3 Canadians also. Cecilia, we're singing your St. Albans Canticles, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that particular setting.
Well, that setting, which you have, I think will be SATB, went to SATB in Auckland. And that wasn't the original setting, because originally I wrote it for the girls' choir at St. Albans Cathedral in England. And that made me think, I suppose, very much, well, obviously, how light I could make it, light and bright. So I was also thinking too, there are certain things I might not do because they were girls, perhaps didn't have the experience that your choir will have. But then there was an opportunity. I was asked if I would write it for SATB. And that was rather nice, because it was good to be able to have the material that was already there and to see how I could augment it and perhaps try and make it interesting for tenors and basses as well. So only they will be able to say whether it's interesting or not. But it was quite an interesting thing to do. I don't think I've actually done quite that before, but yeah, so enjoyable to do. It was, I think, my third set of canticles, which is quite interesting, really, isn't it? When you think about somebody like Herbert Howes, I think he wrote 18 canticles. I mean, for Winchester, Hereford. He wrote, of course, the Collegium Royale, Regale, which, of course, is the King's College, Cambridge one. So I've only written 3 so far.
Well, what sort of things do you need to consider when writing these particular canticles? I mean, these are texts, the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis. These are texts that are very, very well known. And of course, there are probably thousands of settings of the canticles. So what sorts of things do you need to consider when writing a new set?
Well, one thing I remember the first time I was making a setting, which was called St. Martin's Canticles, and that was for St. Martin's in the Fields in London. I saw a lot of a good friend who, alas, has died since, a Catholic priest. And I remember talking to him about the text and asking him just to give me more of an insight into it. And he said something really quite simple. He said, really, it is a narrative, and it is a narrative of joy. And I thought, I was thinking about that, you know, the joyousness of it, and the fact that it is a sort of outpouring, was useful to me for setting it. There was also something I remember somebody telling me when Michael Tippett wrote his Magnificat for St. John's College, Cambridge. He was asked what the most important, I think it was George Guest, who's the conductor then, asked what the most important word was. And I'm not sure I understand this, and perhaps you can give me more of an insight into this. He said the most important word for him was for behold. It's I think it's used 3 times, is it, in the text? But it was quite an interesting thing to hear that. And I was thinking, is it because the word for is it's a continuing line, isn't it? For behold. And so perhaps it's got a really instrumental facility for taking the narrative on, if that makes any sense.
That's good food for thought. I'm going to go back to the text now. How do you go about coming up with something completely original? I mean, I'm not a composer, and so, you know, I'm influenced when I hear music. I'm just influenced by little bits and pieces, and sometimes if I am trying to write something, I think, oh gosh, is that my own, or am I just borrowing that from someone else, from some other piece of music I've heard?
It's interesting, isn't it? He last died a few years ago, but a wonderful composer called John McCabe, and I remember him saying to me at some point that he'd written something he was really proud of, and then he realised that it was Benjamin Britten. So I suppose every composer has this feeling, am I writing my own? Which is one reason why when I'm writing something, I won't listen to anything at all, because I don't want anything to enter into my mind that's not mine. But I think there is always the possibility that what one's writing will be influenced. We're influenced by the past in every way. I suppose just starting writing anything, I do spend quite a lot of time trying to work out where the harmonic content is going to be and what my boundaries might be, so that if it's going to be very diatonic, then I will try and stick within those parameters. There was a piece that I've written, I don't know if you've come across it, I'd love it if you felt like doing it at some point, called A Prayer to St. John the Baptist. And it was commissioned for the Advent Carol service by St. John's College, Cambridge. And that, I don't know whether this is relevant really, but that piece, I set my parameters really tightly, and I used, you know, Guido d'Arezzo, the 11th century monk who formed the mnemonic for the solfa, and he had written, or maybe he'd taken the tune from somewhere else, a prayer to St. John the Baptist, or I think it's a hymn to St. John the Baptist, in which he uses ut, Latin, ut quem laxis, re, and then he goes through all the words. So I used those words and I combined them with another monk, 20th century monk, American, I think, Thomas Merton, who describes St. John the Baptist River, the baptismal river, and I interlaced them. And I thought, well, if I have the Guido d'Arezzo scale, how about I make it into an octatonic scale? And so instead of using the 7 notes, 7 white notes, I've used tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone of the octatonic. And that way it sort of tips it and makes it a little unbalanced in terms of the harmony. And I've used it so that it just literally goes through the whole piece. So you can hear it mounting up. And in between all that, the organ part is, the imagery I had in mind was like a river. So it's a very flowing melody that just goes all the way through to the end. So that in a way is a sort of description of how I might start a piece, find my tightly thought about parameters and try and stick within those. Because I think as a composer, it's really easy to think, oh, that's a great idea, I'll bring that in, and so on, and then perhaps end up with too many ideas. And I think the listener needs things to be able to come back to. Because I know in the St. Albans Canticles, the doxology is the same, isn't it? So when it comes to the Glory Be, in both the Magnificat and the Nunc, I think I've used the same material.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the discoveries there are many discoveries last night in our rehearsal, but one of the discoveries was this point in the alto line where you move from F sharp to A sharp down to G, and it produces this wonderful sort of Hebraic effect. And we were all just kind of like, ooh, getting very excited about that moment last night in the alto section. And some of the other bits that we're sort of very kind of excited about are all the highly rhythmic portions, where you set triplet rhythms and they're syncopated. And so there's, and there's a delivery of text that's very tactile, where you really have to work at putting the text out there, especially with masks on, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Articulation. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting what you say about the alto, because I really do feel, having sung alto so many years, that alto lines can tend not to be so exciting. So it's quite, I like to think of the melodic lines so that there's something perhaps more interesting than just moving from note to note. But that's lovely to hear. Thank you.
Well, the altos thank you for that particular moment when they get to shine.
Oh, that's so lovely.
Well, Cecilia, this has been delightful, and it's always such a pleasure to hear you speak, and it's always such a joy to perform your music and to include it as part of our worship services. And I know our congregation gets so much out of it, and I think they connect that time with you back in 2018. When they hear your music, they're like, oh, yes, that lovely lady that we met back pre-COVID times. And so I hope it won't be too long before we can invite you back to come back to Albuquerque.
Yes, love that. Yeah. Lovely to be with you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Our 2022 commissioned composer, Sarah Cortell, will be here in Albuquerque on Sunday, February 27th. She has written the Cathedral Choir a most excellent piece called Density of Light. I look forward to sharing a conversation with Sarah in a future episode of Greystones. For this upcoming service of choral evensong, however, I've selected a movement from Sanctum, a larger work that Sarah wrote. Sanctum is a 4-movement work written for 5-part unaccompanied upper voices. Sanctum is a captivating setting of 4 movements of the Requiem text inspired by the landscape of the west coast of Canada. Each movement depicts an aspect of Vancouver Island, the water, the mountains, the wind, and the sky, exploring landscape as a place of healing and sanctuary. The combined effect is some of Cortell's most atmospheric and dramatic writing to date. The Lux Aeterna movement, which we'll be singing, typically is found at the conclusion or near the conclusion of a Requiem Mass setting. However, in this season of light, this season of Epiphany, I wanted to explore the theme of light and how different texts point to different ways we see and think about light. The soundscape the upper voices of the choir create is sure to transport the listener. I do hope that you'll join us virtually or in person on Friday, February 4th at 6 p.m. for this special service of Choral Evensong.